Hey everyone, so now that we're done with the Dungeon Speedrun Breakdown series, for those of you that are wondering why I didn't do Sundered, there's a community post on my channel that kind of explains it, but the gist of it is, it would be too similar to the Speedrun strat preview. The strats haven't really changed that much. I kind of made a little short list of some of the small strat changes that have taken place since that run that I originally broke down, that I talked about before the tournament. So if you're interested, you can go and look at that community post. But for now, today we're going to be talking about a series of videos, right? Before the Edge of Fate, where I analyze the sandbox and kind of talk about all the different aspects of endgame Destiny before the Edge of Fate and what I think will change maybe in the Edge of Fate when the DLC comes out, right? So the first of these things is going to be something I'm going to call the state of power creep, okay? Now this is kind of a catchy title, kind of a clickbait title, but really when I say power creep, what I mean, so let's, and again, the return to the PowerPoints because you guys are liking those, but what I mean by is kind of two things, right? So the first thing is, what is the meta like right now? So me, myself, I do these tier lists and I do meta analysis all the time. So I'm very familiar with what goes on in the meta, whether it's, primary DPS, whether it's special weapon DPS, whether it's heavy total damage, whether it's subclass adjustments, stuff like that. I'm very kind of like aware with what's, everything that's going on, but not everyone is like that, right? Because, I play this game like a job basically, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to kind of check in with the meta and analyze the numbers, right? So I haven't really, I've made videos about like archetype tier lists and stuff like that before, but I really want to kind of talk about the numbers at a broad level and maybe talk about how Bungie could improve or might improve or has improved in the past on some of these options, right? And then the second thing is obviously kind of what I just mentioned, which is future potential. So I'm going to talk about, right, the main thing that inspired me to make this video is the idea of like, for example, maybe weapons, right? Let me give you like a really good example. So before Hezen Vengeance was reprised or like refreshed or had its perks kind of changed, there was some rockets in the game that were pretty good, right? You had Apex with Reconstruction Bait, you had like Cold Comfort, you had a bunch of like pretty good rockets, right? But Reconstruction had just been nerfed. We got Tomorrow's Answer, right? But that's also not a perfect frame. So everybody was saying, okay, when Hezen gets refreshed or, when we get a new rocket, it's obviously going to have Envious, Bait, it's probably going to be an aggressive or an adaptive, blah, 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 right? So it's this idea of how far does the power creep ceiling go, right? So when you have a weapon type, maybe energy hand cannon or kinetic bow, or whatever it might be, like how far can Bungie push this weapon to the point where there's not really anything they can do to the weapon to make it any better, besides literally inventing something new, like a new perk or a new archetype or a new weapon type entirely, right? So that's kind of what I'm thinking of when I say like the state of power creep and like examining. I think the original title for this video was like examining the power creep ceiling in Destiny, but that doesn't really, have the right catchiness to it maybe. Okay, anyways, so let's go ahead and move on. That's the goal. The outline today, we're going to be talking about 6 things that are in Destiny that affect the meta pretty much for the most part. So we have archetypes, so weapon archetypes. We have weapon examples themselves. So when I say archetypes, I mean like shotguns versus like maybe rapid fire shotguns. So you have like the actual archetypes and then the weapon families. And then when I say weapons in section 2, that's going to be specific examples of weapons. So aberrant action or indebted kindness, right? And then like analyzing what could maybe be changed on those weapons, right? And then we also have perks, pretty straightforward, origin traits, exotics, this will cover armor and weapons, and subclasses. Now, if you're looking for an extreme deep dive into my opinions on exotic armor, like really specific exotic armor pieces and what I think could be improved about them to make them not kind of neglected in endgame content, this is not that video because that will just not fit within the confines of this video. This video would be like 6 hours long if I did that. So I will definitely make content on exotic armor and like what I think could be done to improve it or where I think it stands in the meta or how good it is, etc., etc. But that's not going to be this video. It's going to be more broad strokes, and we're going to talk about how Bungie might be able to improve exotic armor as a whole or exotic weapons as a whole. Okay, and the same thing is going to apply to subclasses. I've done subclass tier lists in the past. Obviously, my subclass tier list right now has not been updated in a while, and it'll definitely change when Edge of Fate comes out. So I'm not going to like, do a full breakdown here, but I might have some suggestions or some kind of levers that Bungie can shift in order to make subclasses maybe like a bit more balanced or to incentivize players to use them more, which is kind of like the term for power creep in some ways, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with section 1, which is archetypes, okay? So archetypes, for every single section in this video, I'm going to have a slide that's titled methods. And the methods slide is basically going to talk about how does Bungie buff or power creep this specific aspect of the game when it comes to endgame content, right? So when it comes to weapon archetypes, There's 3 ways that Bungie tends to buff weapon archetypes. The first one is direct buffs. So if you remember, pulse rifles had been complained about for a very long time in like year 5 and year 6, and Bungie listened to player feedback and buffed pulse rifles a lot against red bars, right? And so when we get to the primary kind of slide here, you'll see how much pulses have kind of shifted upwards in the meta compared to their, competitors. And then the second option here is new archetype within family, right? So sometimes Bungie will straight up introduce a new archetype entirely. You saw this with heavy burst pulses, heavy burst hand cannons, heavy burst shotguns, a lot of heavy bursting, right? And then now we're also going to have stuff like the longbow, right? The longbow, the same frame as like Wish Ender, that's going to be introduced in legendary form, right? So not always is this like a positive change, right? I don't think, for example, that the longbow is going to become crazy meta, but I could be wrong. But, weapons like the heavy burst hand cannon, definitely power crept when it comes to DPS. And weapons like the heavy burst pulse rifle, definitely power crept when it comes to, ad clear. And Bungie even had to hit down the heavy burst archetype for pulse rifles a little bit because they were overperforming a little bit too much, right? And then finally, we have the third option, which is a new hybrid archetype. So this is an entirely new type of weapon. We saw this with rocket sidearms, right? And then we also are now seeing this with rocket pulses, which are coming out in the Edge of Fate. And so Bungie has shown that they're willing to kind of take the archetype from one ammo type and kind of move it over to another archetype so that it uses another form of ammo, so that the feel of the weapon is the same, but the function is different, right? So that's pretty interesting. But keep these 3 methods in mind when we go ahead and move to these next slides. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about now is primary weapon archetypes. So what I've done here is I've collected all 7 types of primaries in this game from auto to SMG, and then I've taken the archetype that I think people are most likely to use, aka has the highest primary DPS, with some exceptions. Technically, a 180 RPM hand cannon has lower DPS than a 225 or a heavy burst, but most people would prefer to use 180 RPM hand cannons because heavy bursts are a bit unwieldy, their base stats are not amazing, and of course their crit multiplier is very punishing if you miss crits. So I think most people are more willing to use 180 RPM hand cannons. Everything else here, for the most part, though, is just the highest DPS archetype in that family. So the best representative, we're sending the best candidates forward when it comes to comparison here. And the same thing is going to apply for the special and the power slides as well. Okay, so a couple things that I want to talk about before we move on to the next slide. Number one is a standout feature here is that I've colored all of these numbers, gold, silver, and bronze, like, Olympic colors, based on whether they're the first or second or third in the column, right? And you might notice here that SMGs are the only primary type in the game that are just not first, second, or third in anything, right? Their crit ratio is not particularly forgiving, especially for lightweight SMGs. This asterisk means, by the way, that they are not necessarily representative of the rest of the family. But yeah, again, the crit multiplier is not necessarily anything special. Elite DPS is pretty low, minor DPS is pretty low, and range is not particularly amazing either, especially when you consider that sidearms and hand cannons have higher DPS in both, minor and elite categories, and they're not necessarily like more annoying to use either. And when you take into account that SMGs are not going to be hitting all crits, they're naturally like an aggressive recoil weapon, it's kind of sad, right? So I'm expecting SMG buffs to happen in the weapons TWID that comes out at some point in the next week. So kind of expect that to happen. That's, I guess, maybe some form of power creep in some way. That would be like an archetype buff, right? A direct buff like the pulse buff, right? The second thing I want to talk about here is that sidearms and hand cannons, I don't want to call them overperforming because I think they're in a good spot, right? They feel pretty good to use. I think most people would agree on that. But yeah, they are very strong. But something that I will say about hand cannons and sidearms is I don't want them nerfed, but you can see that like their neighbors should be buffed proportionally to match, right? So for example, a hand cannon, you might think a hand cannon has less range than a pulse rifle, but even the highest pulse rifle range archetype in the game, so the heavy burst, 37 meters versus a 180 RPM hand cannon, which is not even the highest range hand cannon in the game, 31 meters. So very, very similar when it comes to range, but the 180 RPM hand cannon has a more forgiving crit multiplier, has higher elite DPS, and very similar minor DPS, right? So pulse rifles, even though they've been freshly buffed, maybe you could argue that they need maybe a slight adjustment or something like that, but the real kicker is going to be like comparing, for example, sidearms and SMGs. That's a 4-meter difference in effective range, but the DPS values you can see between these, like 20k to 28k, that's a huge difference, right? So again, something that we could possibly see when it comes to adjustment, right? And then when it comes to auto rifles and bows and stuff like that, bows are a special case, right? Where obviously, if you're one-shotting ads, they feel pretty good. If you're not one-shotting ads, they feel really terrible. So, it kind of depends on the bow roll as well. So these DPS numbers are like a little bit misleading, and how good bows are or how OP they are or how good they feel in the sandbox is kind of dependent on other variables as well. So maybe don't follow this, too closely. Obviously, it's much lower compared to the other values here, but it's for a good reason, right? They're bows. So That aside, I do want to talk about a couple of things. So the new bow archetype, I don't think it's unlikely to change where bows sit in the meta outside of one-shot thresholds, right? So the new longbow archetype, provided it maybe has the right perks or something like that, it might be able to one-shot adds on contests that like a precision bow is not able to one-shot. So that might increase the viability of bows in the sandbox, generally speaking, right? Outside of special archetypes, right? I want to say like when it comes to the method of adding archetypes, right? So heavy burst and stuff like that. It doesn't really make sense that there would be a heavy burst bow, a heavy burst auto. You know, we already have heavy burst for this and this. Heavy burst scout wouldn't really make sense. That just becomes a 2-burst pulse rifle. Heavy burst sidearm we already have, and then heavy burst SMG doesn't really make sense either, right? So unless Bungie introduces an entirely new type of archetype or a miscellaneous kind of utility archetype like the support auto, we're unlikely to see any major like archetypal changes. Is that even how you say that word? Whatever. Archetypal changes in the sandbox, right? So it's most likely just going to be lever adjustments. I don't want to spend too long on primaries here, but again, so possible bow buffs, maybe auto buffs, maybe some SMG buffs, and we don't really know in terms of adding new archetypes besides new bow. Okay, so next up we have special archetypes. This one's a little bit different, obviously, because special weapons have much more fleshed out roles when it comes to what they're used for in the sandbox. Like if you want to glaive for defense, you know, you're not going to look at the total minor DPS or the optimal DPS against a boss because that's completely an irrelevant metric, right? So it's a little bit different from primaries, but we still have some metrics to compare here. So first thing I want to talk about is rocket sidearms still have relatively high total damage against minors despite having relatively high minor DPS. So obviously, you're not going to use a shotgun or a sniper on adds most of the time, and a fusion rifle, it's kind of a waste to use on adds, especially with that low total damage. So looking at the next in line here, the 4th place in terms of minor DPS, that's going to be rocket sidearms, right? So rocket sidearms still have pretty good minor DPS. Now, the strong comparison here that I want to point out is that rocket sidearms have significantly higher DPS to minors compared to traces, and yet they still have higher total damage. Now, something worth pointing out is that in most content, rocket sidearms will one-shot adds, and so a lot of the damage from the shot that counts as part of the total damage of the rocket sidearm will be wasted, right, in overkilling the ad. But in contest content, I would say that rocket sidearms, surprisingly, despite the fact that traces have insane time to dump and insane reserve sizes when it comes to raw bullets, rocket sidearms actually have higher total damage to minors, which is kind of surprising. Another standout that I want to point out here is that for whatever reason, I've talked about this in previous videos, but snipers have insane minor scalers for some reason. They have, as long as you hit the crit, right? Because obviously if you hit a body, snipers have very unforgiving crit scalers, but for minor scalers in particular, for some reason, snipers just have like insane minor scalers. So this number is very misleading, 2.53 million. That's assuming you hit crits on every single red bar. And a lot of the time, you know, much like how rocket sidearms, they waste kind of total damage by overkilling red bars. Snipers are also going to have that same fate, right? So yeah, I wouldn't recommend using a sniper for ad clear for the most part, but just know that snipers have like insane minor scaling and are really, really good against red bars for one-shotting them as long as you can hit the crit. So very, very efficient in that sense. Okay. The third thing I want to talk about is that surprisingly, we have I should probably explain what these columns mean. So TDPS means typical DPS. So that also applies to the previous slide. Typical DPS just means when you're out and about and you're just shooting your, primary at some ads, and then you reload it and then you keep shooting, what's the DPS over like a sustained period like that? And when I say typical, I mean, I think I just put like one loader on. I think that was it. And I used like a pretty standard example of like a primary for that archetype. So for like an SMG, maybe I took like Ikelos SMG for aggressive SMGs, and then I put one arc loader on, and then that was the DPS with that. So it's meant to simulate like the average situation of you using that weapon like out in the wild against red bars, right? And then LDPS is Lunafaction's DPS. So this is still being manually reloaded, but you have like max reload speed, right? Because obviously otherwise some weapon archetypes would be punished very disproportionately. Like double fire special GLs have really, really terrible manual reload if you don't have any reload boosters, right? So Lunafaction DPS is kind of like, if you're just using this on a boss and you have a Lunafaction well or like a rally barricade or whatever, or like rally, reload boosters, like what's the DPS going to be? And then ODPS is optimal DPS, or technically one mag DPS. So this is like, if you're able to shoot this weapon at max fire rate without ever reloading. So for example, a good example would be like a rewind rounds fusion rifle, or like a rewind round sniper, or like a rocket sidearm with like, I don't know, like overflow or something, right? So just basically a scenario where you're like able to just shoot over and over without really having to worry about the reload, or using like envious arsenals, so like you never have to reload. this is like that kind of scenario, right? So something I wanted to point out here is that fusions, shotguns, and snipers, the best archetypes of the three, rapid, no surprise there. Their LDPS is actually very similar, which was surprising to me. I thought shotguns and snipers would have a little bit higher, especially snipers, because obviously rapid fire shotguns need to be loaded like one shot at a time. That kind of makes sense. But I was kind of surprised to see rapid fire snipers being as like low as they are here compared to rapid fire fusions. They're like in the same neighborhood. But obviously once you get to the point where you're not reloading anymore, you know, rapid fire fusion DPS goes up very little, and then rapid fire shotgun and rapid fire sniper DPS goes up a lot, right? So you can see here how kind of people might prefer fusions for like moment to moment gameplay, where you're kind of aiming for consistency. Whereas if you're more optimized and you're really going for like a boss bake, then you might opt for like a sniper or a shotgun, which kind of is in line with the community sentiment towards like, for example, tractor special weapon options, right? Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is, in terms of like standout features, is that rapid fire snipers have very high boss total damage, right? So you might think, okay, well, they're third, that's not that high, right? But most of the time, if you're using a rapid fire sniper for boss DPS and you are going for total damage, you're going to use 4 times a charm, right? And there's no other weapon here that really has a similar perk besides slug shotguns, and slug shotguns have lower DPS than rapid fire snipers and also have a crit requirement, and you know, they have to be used in melee range, right? So this number basically almost doubles, like it almost goes to 1.4 million if you have 4 times a charm, which obviously would put it head and shoulders above everything else here. So that's something to note as well. So yeah, that's pretty much all I want to talk about. I mean, we could add some like heavy burst options here to like several of these like different options. Heavy burst shotguns are getting buffed next season, so we'll have to see where they sit in the meta after that. I could see them being like a replacement for rapid fire shotguns for specifically the purposes of just like mag dumping, but you know, we'll see what happens. Obviously heavy burst shotguns have extremely slow reload as well, so you know, it could potentially be interesting. And then finally, I think the 2 weapons that could potentially have like a new archetype added to them are like sniper. You know, I could see like heavy burst sniper being a thing where you know, shoot 2 shots at a time or something. And maybe trace, right? Because trace is kind of lonely, right? Just adaptive trace. That's the only frame we have. I could see like a new trace rifle archetype being made. You know, maybe like a support trace or something silly like that. So we could see something like that happen. And then in terms of archetype adjustments, I think the sandbox is not too unhealthy right now. Glaive archetypes are a bit, you know, interesting, I suppose. Maybe special GLs could use a bit of a buff, but I don't really think Bungie is going to touch much in the special weapon sandbox, to be honest with you, because I think for the most part, special weapons are not too unbalanced, but I could be completely wrong. You know, maybe when the TWID comes out next week, they're going to adjust all the special weapons, but you know, we'll see. Okay, next up we have power weapons. Power weapons, there's only 5 families, and the archetypes I've chosen are as shown here. Now, the only question that you might have here, or maybe 2 questions that you might have here, are first, why'd you pick high impact for machine guns? So machine guns, the way the community perceives machine guns are they're very specific about which machine gun they're talking about. So when you look at commemoration, for example, people don't love commemoration because it's an adaptive machine gun, right? That might be a small factor, but the reason is because the perks, the feel of the gun, and the origin trait, stuff like that, right? That's why people like commemoration. Now, the thing that me and my friend Spider have looked at a bunch of machine guns, and we've realized that we've never actually had a really, really good high impact machine gun in this game. And I do think that high impact machine guns are the best archetype in the game, right? They're very slow firing. So for on hit perks like jolting feedback, they're not that great, right? But for, you know, for other stuff, they have by far the highest total damage of any machine gun archetype. Their minor DPS is not that different from the others. And they're just, you know, they're just pretty good overall as a result of that, right? So I do think that if we got a high impact machine gun in Edge of Fate that, for example, had like demo and like destabilizing rounds and an excellent origin trait and like decent stats, I think people would think it's the best machine gun in the game. But we'll talk about that more in the next section, which is like the weapon section where we talk about specific examples. I kind of like spoiled a little bit there. Okay, so machine guns, very high minor total, as you can see here, gold, right? 4.27 million. The others are not even close. Even rockets, this is with Pack Hunter, by the way, right? So even then it's like not particularly high, even though rockets have very good minor scaling. LDPS is surprisingly, again, like I mentioned with special weapons, I think Bungie, when they do testing to their weapon types to like keep them balanced, they probably use like, you know, like Luna Faction reload or something like that, because these numbers are also like surprisingly fairly similar. Swords come out on top if you're just manually reloading weapons, but obviously, you know, heavy GLs and rockets, you're using stuff like Envious Arsenal, so manual reload is not really a concern. But you can see here that like swords are better than like linears, right? When both of them are just used with Lunas, which is how you would use them. Obviously, sword is not impacted by Lunas, but you know what I mean? So yeah, LDPS, pretty similar across most of the archetypes. Obviously, machine guns are really lagging behind. So even if you have target lock, you can imagine like a 40% offset here. Still not enough to really compete with some of the other options here. And then when we come to optimal DPS, This one's a bit of a tough one because rockets, you're not shooting like 11 rockets in a row, or I guess 8 when come Edge of Fate. You're not shooting like, 8 rockets in a row. So like this is not really a realistic number, but you can see here that, the rockets and the heavy GLs really separate from the rest of the pack once you're able to shoot them like consecutively, or once you don't need to account for manual reload. Okay. And then finally, the last thing that I want to talk about is that heavy GLs and especially rockets are hit very hard by the fact that there's no more reserve mods come Edge of Fate. So I don't know if Bungie is going to do like 100 resilience move where like the new 0 is now 100 resilience. And so like the new 0 like reserve mods, or like there's no reserve mods anymore, is going to be like equivalent to 3 reserves. I kind of hope that's the case, because if that's not the case, aggressive rockets with no envious arsenal, because envious arsenal is not going to boost inventory size anymore. That's not a real stat anymore. And with no reserve mods, rockets have 8 rockets, right? You have 8 rockets, 8 Hezen, right? Which is like, that's like you're losing 3 rockets. That's a lot of damage. And so even with Pack Hunter, the total damage of an aggressive rocket with no reserve mods is 0.94 million, right? So 940,000 damage. And then look at all of the other options here, right? So machine guns, bad boss scalers, still 2.2 million. Swords with Pack Hunter again, 1.62 million. Kind of makes sense for swords, right? But like linears and heavy GLs, you can see that the heavy GLs and the rockets are just so far behind linears, and it just kind of I don't know, I feel like total damage could be adjusted here. I could be wrong, right? Maybe you have more than 8 rockets come Edge of Fate, but yeah, rockets even with Pack Hunter, with an exotic that's specifically designed to increase total damage and DPS and whatever, they're still like really lagging in terms of total damage. So another maybe concern there that Bungie could touch. Okay. I think blanket wise, I think heavy GLs could use maybe like a little bit of a buff, right? Because it's kind of insane that like a heavy GL underperforms against like a caster frame sword, or like it's kind of crazy to me that a rapid fire heavy GL, even if you're manually reloading it, because of how little total damage it has compared to a linear, and you can't buff it with Galley or anything, right? And the DPS is almost the same as an adaptive burst linear, right? So I think the heavy GL nerf was kind of like unjustified, and I hope that heavy GLs get like a little bit of a compensatory buff. But yeah, so I think they could probably buff heavy GLs. And then in terms of new archetypes, I don't really see it happening for most of the weapon types. Maybe linears, because linears only have 2 archetypes, right? They're a fairly novel weapon, I guess, compared to the other weapon types here. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much it for archetypes, right? A lot of this was kind of more like feedback, I guess, or like ideas about what's unbalanced in the sandbox right now. But again, I wanted to make this video to be kind of like a meta check-in for you guys before the Edge of Fate, so you guys have all the numbers available to you, and you can kind of just see at a glance, oh, this is good, or this is not as good, or exactly, just comparison, right? Okay, next up we have weapons. So specific weapons. The method slide here is going to cover how I think Bungie tends to power creep, or can power creep, or buff weapons. Okay, so unlike the archetypes, there's 5 methods here, right? The first one that we've seen a lot of is double damage perks, right? So I'm talking stuff like Cascade Point plus damage perks, so like Explosive Light, Bait and Switch, whatever. Hezen, for example, has Cluster in its left column, right? So Bungie is slowly introducing double damage perk options to heavy weapons, especially. Primary weapons, special weapons, mostly primary weapons have had these for a long time. But it's kind of like a more novel thing for stuff like rockets and, machine guns and whatever, right? With like Hammerhead, for example. Okay, next up we have double splash perks. I mean, you guys have seen this plenty, right? Fatebringer, Explosive Payload, Firefly. There's tons of primaries these days that are getting 2 splash perks, right? I think maybe the most recent example I can think of is Unworthy, right? The scout rifle from Sunder Doctrine has Firefly Volt Shot, right? So that's another way Bungie can power creep weapons and just make them stronger, is just give them 2 splash perks, right? Third, we have utility plus splash perk. You've seen that on multi-mock, right? So it's like attrition orbs or like demo with a splash perk, right? So that's like a utility perk. Next up, for the 4th thing, we have perk spread. So what I mean by perk spread is a lot of the time when Bungie makes a new perk, they'll restrict it to a specific weapon family or a specific weapon type, right? So Discord, for example, when it first came out, was not on a lot of weapons, right? And it's still not on, for example, area denials or rocket sidearms, because it would be pretty strong on those weapon types. But in the future, if Bungie wants to make maybe an area denial more desirable to people, or maybe a rocket sidearm more desirable to people, that's something they could do. They could introduce Discord and move it from its traditionally understood pool of weapons to a new weapon, right? And you're also starting to see, for example, Discord on heavy weapons. Discord, we got it on our first heavy weapon this season on a linear. Now, is that linear good? Are people using it for ad clear? No. But it is there. It is like, it's possible. We now know that Bungie is willing to put Discord on heavy weapons and might do so in the future, right? Attrition orbs, for example, being moved to area denials, and weapons that are like not primaries that take forever to trigger area denial. or attrition orbs, I should say. And then chain reaction is another good example, right? Glaives are getting chain reaction now. Shotguns are getting chain reaction now. It was formerly pretty much just the heavy GL perk, right? So they can spread these perks to new weapons. And then finally, Bungie can also, when I say better archetype, I don't mean like the other way of making like a better archetype. What I mean is Bungie made a bunch of heal clip incandescent pulse rifles like right before Salvation's Edge came out. You know, we had a Hortative, we had the one from Prophecy, like Darkest before, and then Bungie made a heal clip incandescent again, but on a better archetype, right? So Bungie is capable of not necessarily making a new archetype, but maybe the best example I can give you right now is like, you know, the 600 RPM SMG like Noxious Vetiver from episode Revenant. So that has attrition orbs and jolting feedback, but what's stopping a lot of people from using it, and it has a great origin trait too, what's stopping people from using it is that it's a 600 RPM, right? So it feels really bad to use in PvE. However, if Bungie were to, you know, transmute and give that exact same perk combo, and not origin trait obviously, but, you know, mostly the same power level stuff to a lightweight SMG, I'm sure a lot of people would be willing to use it, right? So that's one way that Bungie can improve on a weapon and power creep previous weapons, right? Okay, so next we have 3 slides here. Primary weapons, special weapons, power weapons. Let's start with primary weapons. So I'm not going to go over everything here because it would take me forever. I'm just going to go through the highlights, right? So we have what I think is the best example of like a kinetic auto, kinetic bow, kinetic hand cannon, etc. Like Origin Story, for example, you could argue and put Chroma Rush here instead. Origin Story has attrition kinetic and it's a precision, so it has a worse archetype, but Chroma Rush is a better archetype. It has, you know, it's a rapid fire, but it only has like subsistence in the first column, right? So you know, take it or leave it, whatever, right? It's kind of whatever I think is kind of clustered near the top of the meta, right? And then when I say Edge of Fate kinetic, like that column, the second column here, what I'm referring to is what I think could be improved about this weapon. So basically, if there's a lot of words in the column that says Edge of Fate, that means I think that the power creep ceiling is very far away from where the weapon currently sits. Whereas if there's only like one word, for example, just archetype, right? For example, Unloved, instead of being like a heavy burst hand cannon, it could have been a 180 RPM hand cannon. And then people maybe would have preferred it a bit more, right? So there's like, you know, there's different things that can be improved on different weapons. Some things that I guess I would like to point out. So room to grow, I think the biggest room to grow are probably kinetic auto and kinetic sidearm. The best kinetic sidearms that we have are like Breach Light and like Buzzard. You'll notice that a lot of the kinetic slot stuff tends to have a lot of room to improve because just objectively speaking, the kinetic slot ad clear perks like Stasis, Strand, and Kinetic Affinity, they tend to not be as good as like Incandescent or Jolting Feedback, or, you know, we've talked about this before. So you're going to see a lot of the kinetic stuff in my room to grow section. But yeah, room to grow, I think kinetic auto, kinetic sidearm, probably the most. And then almost perfect is like Word of Crota and Unworthy, right? So Word of Crota, if you think about an optimal primary, or like what is the, if you wanted to kit out like a, you know, a perfect primary, right? What do you need, right? Well, double splash perks would be good, or utility plus splash perks. So Word of Crota has repulsor destabilizing, which is excellent. And then it has Curse Thrall, which is arguably one of the best ad clear origin traits in the game. It's like a perk all on its own. And then it's a 180 RPM hand cannon, right? So it's like, it's pretty much perfect. There's nothing, there's literally nothing you could do to it to improve it besides maybe, I don't know, give it seconds. It doesn't have Dragonfly destabilizing too. Yeah, so it literally has double splash potential as well. So it is like pretty much perfect, right? There's nothing you can do to improve Word of Crota, right? Unworthy is another example, right? So Firefly Volt Shot, both excellent on a scout rifle, and it has Subjugation, one of the most OP origin traits we've ever seen on any weapon type, especially for primaries as well, right? So Unworthy, not really much you can do to like improve on it too much. And so that's why there's like question marks here, right? So interesting how Bungie will maybe, you know, in the future, the way that power creep works obviously is when Bungie introduces an energy hand cannon, it's always going to be weighed against Word of Crota. Like, is it better than Word of Crota? And like, I'm curious to see how Bungie is going to be able to potentially surpass stuff that I think is like pretty much perfect, right? So yeah, interesting stuff. Anytime there's an asterisk here, by the way, it means that, like, for example, non-denouement could be surpassed in some ways, but Bungie would need to create a new perk configuration on a bow that doesn't currently exist, right? So for example, putting Heal Clip Incandescent on a bow could be potentially interesting, maybe on like a long bow, so it's more likely to one-shot ads. Heal Clip has never been on a bow before, but I think if Heal Clip was on a bow, could be potentially interesting, right? So that's why there's an asterisk here. It would need to literally have a new perk brought onto a bow that's never been on a bow before, okay? So next we have special weapons, okay? Special weapons are a little bit less complicated, I guess. I think most special weapons are pretty close to like very good, I would say. But I will still give you the highlights, right? So Room to grow, I would say fusions in general. So I think scatter signal, could be better. Could have like rewind rounds, could have like a better damage perk. I think controlled burst being like the de facto special fusion damage perk is not like particularly amazing. There could be better perks, right? We've seen elemental honing on fusions like this season, but not on any like really good fusions. So we'll see, right? Zealot's Reward also has like auto and controlled burst, which auto could be better. It could be like rewind instead, which would be better. And the origin traits could be improved as well, right? Whereas when we were talking about primaries, right? When I said Unworthy and Word of Crota are like literally perfect, the origin traits were excellent as well, right? Whereas Scatter Signal, Dragon's Vengeance is not that good. Zealot's Reward, the Gauss Photo Inhibition. Yeah, sorry, that's the origin trait. That's not very good either, right? So when I say perfect, I mean like, everything has to kind of like, knock it out of the park, right? I also think Energy Sniper could be improved a lot. I have Keen Thistle listed here. I mean, you could argue and put Omniscient Eye here because it's a rapid with 4 times PI, but Praetor's Revenge literally has double damage perk potential. It has Rewind. Well, I guess Rewind's not even that necessary, but it has double damage perk potential. It has Discord potential. It has 4 times the Charm. It has every good damage perk known to man. It has Add Clear perks. It has everything, right? And so, Omniscient Eye kind of pales in comparison to that. So, I'd maybe like to see like a 4 times bait and switch, 140 sniper in the energy slot at least, kind of like a nitpick. It's not really that important. A lot of people don't really use energy snipers for damage anyways, especially legendary ones, but a little bit of a nitpick there. Okay. In terms of ideas of what Bungie could do to further power creep special weapons, Discord on other weapon configs, right? So imagine a Discord mountaintop, right? A Discord breach GL, or imagine a Discord area denial, right? Or like Discord on a high impact fusion with reservoir burst, right? We have Discord reservoir burst fusions this season, but they're adaptive frame, right? So they're much less likely to one-shot ads on like contest. But if you had like a high impact with Discord reservoir burst and maybe like a good origin trait, that could potentially be interesting, right? So Discord on more and more and more weapons, maybe on rockets atoms as well, could potentially be cool. And then I think on-hit splash perks on area denials are the next step. So Bungie with area denials, the thing that they kind of did with area denials that I'm a little bit concerned about, well, not concerned, but Lost Signal released with really, really good perks, right? Like auto one for all, great, auto demo, stuff like that. And it has radial area transposer, which is excellent. And then VS Velocity Baton obviously has a repulsor destabilizing. It has repulsor attrition, demo attrition, lots of great perks, right? So how are you going to make area denials better? How are you going to make area denials in the future be appealing to players so that they're not going to be like, oh, well, Velocity Baton is just better. I'm not going to farm for this, right? And the answer is, I think, on-hit splash perks, right? So imagine an arc area denial with jolting feedback. I mean, that would be insane, right? Or a solar area denial with burning ambition, which is the new Scorch on hit perk, right? So that's another option. Or maybe like like a kinetic area denial with like kinetic tremors or something. I don't know. You get what I'm saying, right? So would be pretty crazy. But yeah, that's all my ideas for special weapons. Again, you can look pretty closely here. Praetor's Revenge, I think it's unironically like perfect. Like I don't think you could do anything to Praetor's Revenge to make it really any better with the current known landscape of Destiny 2. And the same goes for Chronophage, although I would say trace rifles in general are like a little underwhelming for the most part, right? So you might be thinking, okay, well, why do you have Chronophages being perfect? It's not like an insane weapon or anything, but I think that's more reflective of trace rifles not being like particularly amazing compared to like Chronophage not being amazing, right? Because Chronophage has repulsor destabilizing, it has shoot to loot destabilizing, it has radial area transposer, which is perfect, and then there's not really much else you're really looking for in a trace. Okay, so yeah, that's it for special weapons. Let's move on to power weapons next. So power weapons, a lot less to talk about, and there's only one slot for power weapons, thankfully. So for drum GLs, I have 2 different roles here. I have one for add clear and I have one for damage, right? So add clear, we have Hullabaloo. Bungie hasn't really experimented that much with the compressed waveframe archetype since Guardian games, I guess, right? We've had Dimensional and we have Hullabaloo. So we've had literally 2 of them. And the 2 of them, Hullabaloo has some, good perks for add clear and stuff. But I could see Bungie going pretty crazy, right? Give me Discord on a compressed waveframe, and I guarantee you people will be around the block lining up for that. Okay, so there's definitely room for power creep here. And the origin trait's not like particularly amazing either. I mean, Nanotic Tracer Rockets is kind of nice, but the one Hullabaloo has is not amazing, right? In terms of damage, VS Chill Inhibitor, right? I mean, it's more that heavy GLs are not that good right now, but VS Chill Inhibitor itself is pretty good. Origin trait could be better for like boss TPS. But yeah, perks, you'd have to like cook up some new perks. You'd have to literally give it maybe like double damage perks or like a new GL perk in order to make it more appealing. Also, I kind of strayed away from my structure here, so let me go back to my structure. Room to grow stuff, okay? So I think swords and LMGs have the biggest room to grow. They are the furthest away from their potential like ceiling. Swords, you might be surprised because like Summon Bonum just came out, and it's like a waveframe, which is, arguably like the best archetype in the game. And it's chock filled with good perks, and the origin trait's pretty bad. I think most people know that. But so yeah, why do I have it as being like the furthest? Well, first of all, I think Heavy weapons, generally speaking, are like pretty close to their power creep ceilings compared to like primaries, especially, or like specials. So, you know, having a sword and like a linear close to the power creep ceiling, you know, it's kind of whatever. And I do think, right, if they gave a caster frame sword, like double damage perks, right? For example, because Bungie has shown that they're willing to put 2 damage perks on a sword, right? Look at Falling Guillotine, Frenzy, Bait and Switch, you know, Vorpal, Bait and Switch, whatever you want to use. So they're willing to put double damage perks on a sword. They just haven't done it on like a good sword archetype yet. So if they do it to like a caster frame, or they do it to like an adaptive frame with buffed impact or whatever, and they give like an actual good origin trait that like increases charge rate or like increases damage over time or something, you know, that could be really good, right? So that's swords. Linears, the main reason is linears are just becoming really stale. And when Bungie sees that like the perk pools of a specific weapon become really, really stale and really, really one note, they tend to either introduce a new perk or make something exciting, right? Make something exciting. So linears, you could potentially see one in the future with like 2 damage perks, like a charge rate perk and like an actual raw damage perk, like controlled burst plus bait and switch or something crazy like that. Or you might see them give triple tap to an adaptive burst linear at some point in the future, right? Like, you know how they're giving Discord to linear right now? Maybe they might give triple tap to a linear that's an adaptive burst like a year from now, right? I don't think we're close to that level of power creep yet, but maybe someday, right? Maybe someday they will. Yeah, that's pretty much it for swords. Oh, I said linear, right? I meant LMG. So yeah, the reason why I meant LMG is we talked about this earlier, but I do think like a really good high impact LMG would sell like hotcakes. Okay. Almost perfect would be Rocket and Heavy GL. Rocket, I don't really think I need to tell you why. I mean, it's Hessen, right? It has the best or one of the best origin traits for damage in the game. It has double damage perk potential. It has Envious. It has Overflow. It has every single good damage perk known to man. You know the story with Hessen, right? And then Heavy GLs, like again, like Heavy GLs, you can't really do anything to VS Chill Inhibitor besides maybe improve its origin trait to make it any better. You would have to literally either invent new perks or put perks on a Heavy GL that you've never put on a Heavy GL before, or like a perk combo on a Heavy GL that you've never had before. So instead of Cascade, like a true damage perk alongside like a Sandor damage perk, right? Okay, so that is pretty much it. You know, more double damage perk stuff, better high impact LMG. That's kind of most of my ideas for power weapons. Let's move on. I don't know how long this video is going to be. It's probably going to be pretty long. Okay. Perks. So how does Bungie power creep perks or make them better, right? And Bungie, I would say if you've been watching Bungie and you see how their sandbox team interacts with what's in the game or versus like when they make new stuff, they follow a pretty like consistent trend, right? So these method slides might be interesting to those of you who are interested in understanding how Bungie's sandbox team interacts with the sandbox and like, you know, changes stuff. So the 4 methods that Bungie uses to buff perks or power creep perks are: number 1, create an entirely new effect. Now, this is a very, very broad spectrum thing, like a very broad category, I guess, but they don't do it that often, right? So an example would be Detonator Beam. But when I say a new effect, I can also mean having a perk access a new effect. So an effect that already exists in the game, like Weaken, was recently given to perks in the form of Withering Gaze and Demoralize, right? So before this, if you do Control F in the perk kind of description area in the compendium, you're not going to find Weaken on anything but Demoralize and Withering Gaze. So this is an example of Bungie giving a brand new effect that was previously not accessible to legendary weapon perks to legendary weapon perks. So an example of a new perk would be maybe like a legendary perk that gives you invisibility or Woven Mail, because we've never had something like that before. So that's going to be in the idea slides. Okay. Another example would be like a new trigger, right? So we had a Jolt perk in the game before. It's called Volt Shot, right? However, Bungie made a new perk called Jolting Feedback, which is an on-kill reload. Instead, the trigger is on hit, right? So Bungie might improve the ease of access to a specific effect and make it easier to access by changing the trigger while keeping the effect and the outcome the same, right? The third way that Bungie kind of buffs perks is a stronger effect, right? This is like the classic power creep example. It's just bigger number, right? So Elemental Honing versus Bait and Switch. Elemental Honing is 35, Bait and Switch is 30, Honing is 40 in some cases, right? On kinetics. Okay, and then fourth, we have easier effect, right? So this is similar to the second bullet point, new trigger. This is basically for the same outcome, it's just easier to access this, but it's not a trigger necessarily, right? I mean, I guess they're kind of similar, but what I mean is like, for example, Reconstruction versus Autoloading Holster versus Envious Arsenal, right? Envious Arsenal is easier to use and has higher quality of life, I suppose. I mean, I guess easier effect is very similar to new trigger. Maybe I should have merged them both into one bullet point, but you get the idea. They're kind of separate ideas in to some degree. Okay. So there are 4 categories of perk. Okay, I should be more specific. In the Aegis Relic universe of perk analysis, okay, there are, I think, 12 categories of perks, but I extracted PvP from this. It's separate, right? So we have 11 categories of perks, and I've split them, I believe, into 4 groups, 4 subcategories, okay? So the first one is mag. So these are perks that affect your mag size or affect the amount of bullets you have, just they affect your mag, okay? So the first perk is, or the first perk category, I should say, is called Overflow, right? And so these perks basically just overflow your mag. They're good for DPS, right? For example, Envious Assassin on rockets, rewind rounds on snipers and fusions. 4 times a charm, believe it or not, is an overflow perk because you get ammo back into your mag, you're able to shoot for twice the time, right? So 4 times a charm effectively sort of doubles your mag size, so it counted as an overflow perk. Now, in the Edge of Fate, I have no idea how Bungie is going to create a new overflow perk that is better than any of these. Maybe unnerfing Envious Assassin is a start, but I legitimately have no idea how Bungie would power creep the current overflow perks that exist in the game. You could make, like, I don't know, 5 times the charm or something and like increase the ratio of ammo, but that would be just like a raw quantity buff, and I don't expect them to do that because 4 times the charm is already very strong. It essentially doubles the total damage that precision weapons have access to, and I don't think they're going to go for like triple or anything like that. So yeah, I don't know, pretty hard. Rewind rounds basically allows you to, like, on some weapon types, shoot infinitely, pretty much, right? So I really don't know how Bungie's going to, you know, buff overflow perks or power creep them, okay? The second thing is refill perks. Now, refill perks are like auto-loading holster, envious arsenal, demolitionist, shoot to loot, anything that refills your mag, right? Whether it's stowed or whether your weapon is ready. Again, I have no idea how Bungie is going to power creep envious arsenal, demo, and shoot to loot in the current forms. By the way, the perks that I have in the final shape column, these are the perks that are the highest ranked on the perk tier list for the specific category, okay? So yeah, envious arsenal, like it's pretty hard to like make a perk that's stronger than just like being able to shoot 2 other weapons and then your whole mag is reloaded, right? It's pretty hard to imagine that. I mean, unless they made a perk that like literally allows you to just fire infinitely, but like that doesn't make any sense. So I don't know, it's pretty hard to power creep that, I guess. Thankfully, I do have some ideas for the other 2 categories. So we have the reload category. That's like your classic reload perks. So like rapid hit, you know, outlaw. And then in this case, we have air trigger, field prep, and impulse amplifier. Okay. So air trigger and field prep, both of them are going to be changed to ammo generation stat buffs instead of being reserve stat buffs. So that's going to be potentially interesting and maybe change where they're ranked in the perk tier list. And then you have impulse amplifier, which literally has no condition whatsoever in terms of how good it is. You always have it active, which is why it is one of the highest ranked on the tier list. The only thing that we can really say that would maybe power creep what we have right now is a perk like Eddy Current, right? Eddy Current, you need to be amplified to activate its effect. We could potentially see a perk that maybe if you have any buff at all, like Radiant, Void Overshield, Devour, like any of that stuff, you get a reload buff, right? So that would be potentially the next step in power creep in terms of ease of access, right? But I don't know. It's kind of hard to power creep the current reload perks. I have a feeling maybe Bungie is going to release some mediocre reload perks in the meantime on Edge of Fate launch, or maybe not make any more reload perks at all. Okay. Next up, we have ammo perks. So ammo perks are just perks that affect your ammo economy. There's going to be more perks in like a slightly different subcategory later on in the Edge of Fate, because ammo generation is now a stat that Bungie is willing to adjust as a lever that is being affected by weapon perks and armor mods and stuff like that. So there's definitely going to be, I think impromptu ammunition was already a perk that was shown by creators to increase your ammo generation stat. So we're definitely going to be adding those to the perk tier list, and they would fit into this category. But for now, 4 times a charm, lead from gold, relentless strikes, classic ammo perks. Ammo generation, like I mentioned, is one of the ideas, and Discord on heavies, right? So Discord, for example, on a rocket or Discord on a heavy GL would be insane, right? Discord on like a heavy GL with like a good damage perk would be pretty crazy, right? So that would be one way that Bungie could power creep perks in some ways. Okay. Next, we have damage perks. Okay, so there's 3 categories of damage perks that I've identified in Destiny 2. You have burst damage perks, which are for burst, right? You have sustained damage perks, which are like for boss DPS, long periods of time. And then you have spree damage perks, which are like rampage, right? Your perks they use on like machine guns and stuff like that for short periods of time, but not really meant for boss DPS, but also not really relevant for like raw burst damage either, right? You're not going to take like a rampage rocket and like use it on a boss, right? So burst damage perks, right? There's a couple ideas that I have. So the examples of this perk type would be like redirection, cascade point, recombination. The first thing is on hit fire rate, right? So imagine, for example, it's basically like, you know how Thunderlord ramps up as you shoot it more? you could put that on a legendary perk, right? So you could have like a sniper that shoots faster as you shoot more. It's like cascade point without having to shoot other weapons, right? So could potentially be interesting. Maybe it wouldn't be like power creep, because I do think cascade point would just be better, because it doesn't need to ramp up. But you know, could be. I don't know. We'll see. And then sustain damage from other weapons, right? So when I say burst perks, oh, actually on hit fire rate was probably supposed to go into the sustained category. Okay, my bad. I should say, okay, the idea that I had for burst perks in Edge of Fate is, so right now we have a perk recombination where if you do get kills, elemental kills with other weapons, it buffs the next shot from the recombination weapon, right? And then redirection is like if you do damage with that weapon. So my idea is maybe a new re-perk could be sustained damage from other weapons, right? So when you're doing DPS, if you do a lot of damage with like your kinetic and your energy weapon, then your power weapon with this perk would do more damage the next time you swap to it, right? So that would be potentially interesting. And then obviously Bungie is willing to make damage perks that are based on swapping, like Bait and Switch and Envious Arsenal and stuff like that. So, you know, it's not necessarily without precedent. Okay, sustained damage perks, Bait and Switch, Elemental Honing, Trench Barrel kind of speak for themselves. Higher percent, that's like the most obvious one, right? If they made a 40% damage perk that was like slightly harder to trigger than Bait and Switch or something, I'm sure everyone would use that, right? And then on-hit elemental perks. On-hit elemental, what I mean by that is like when you shoot a target, it automatically unravels them. Or when you shoot a target, it automatically scorches them, like Burning Ambition, for example. So for maybe these specifically strong like subclass effects, maybe like an area denial with jolting feedback, for example, like that would be potentially decent for DPS for applying jolt if you have no other jolt source, right? So yeah, that's what I mean by on-hit elemental effect. And then finally, we have spree perks. Spree perks, pretty simple as well. Higher percentage or like a hybrid effect, right? So imagine if Desperate Measures came with a reload buff built into it, right? Like this, the way that Firefly does. So that's what I think could be potentially useful on like machine guns and stuff like that. Or maybe a spree perk that's like Adrenaline Junkie, but imagine it also buffs your grenade stat when you get kills, right? So potentially interesting stuff for damage perks, power creep wise. Next up, we have splash perks. So splash perks, they're technically like a single of the like 11 categories that I mentioned, but the way splash perks work in Destiny is that they're generally restricted to weapons of that affinity, right? Now there's some exceptions. For example, Firefly they put it on everything, right? It's on a strand weapon, it's on an arc weapon, it's on kinetic weapons, it's on everything, right? So Firefly is a bit of an exception, but stuff like Incandescent and, you know, Hatchling and Chill Clip, you know, it stays in the affinity of the weapon that it's on, right? And so I kind of decided to split by affinity here, all right? Kinetic splash weapons or kinetic splash perks, I should say, they're quite unique, right? Kinetic Tremors and Firefly are like completely their own effect. So I have no idea how Bungie is going to potentially address or change or, you know, power creep them. Stasis, I think Bungie could make a perk that spreads slow on kill. So kind of like Aggers. Well, Aggers freezes nearby stuff on kill, but I just mean slow, because obviously then you'd power creep Aggers, right? Because Headstone, we have Crystal on precision kill. Chill Clip, we have slow on hit. So why not slow on kill, right? So why not like slow spread on kill, I should say, right? That could be a potentially interesting perk. Now you could argue that that's like not that different from Chill Clip, but you know, it's an idea, right? And then strand perks. Strand perks, obviously what we're missing right now in a big way is Unravel, right? Unraveling rounds, you can get it from, you know, some sources, for example, like in your subclass or in the artifact. But in terms of like perks, there's not really any perks that like interplay with Unravel. So we could potentially have a perk where like if you get a crit kill on an ad, it releases like a spread of unraveling projectiles. Or the more you damage an enemy, it'll eventually unravel after a certain amount of hits, right? So maybe like a strand waveframe, or not, sorry, not a strand waveframe, sorry, a strand area denial, and you'd shoot it at a boss and eventually it would unravel it just from you shooting it, right? So that could be a potential perk. Solar, Scorch on hit. I mean, Burning Ambition has already been revealed, so that's kind of the only thing I can really imagine, because that would be an example of changing the trigger for Scorch. And there's not really other like splash perks, I guess, on Solar, because, you know, it's just Scorch and Ignite. You know, that's the only thing that Solar has access to. And then Arc, we have Jolting Feedback and Volt Shot. And the obvious answer to Arc is that we don't have any blind on hit or blind on crit kill or any sort of blind triggers from perks. So I could see, you know, blind on hit being potentially interesting, maybe just blinding the target that's being hit to keep it a little balanced. Or I could see blinding if you crit kill a target and it blinds the nearby enemies. That could be potentially pretty interesting. You know, I could see Bungie making a perk name that has like some pun, you know, involving flashbangs or something like that. That could be interesting. And then finally, Void. Void Splash perks. Destabilizing rounds and Demoralize kind of have most of the stuff covered, but there are no perks in the game right now on legendary weapons that deal with Suppress. So Suppress is a pretty strong effect, but you know, if it came from a Void weapon, could be pretty interesting, right? Could put it on a perk. Okay, this video is going to be a lot longer than I expected. Okay, finally, we have the other category for perks, okay? And the other category for perks, we have ability and utility. Ability is referring to perks that give you ability regen, so Demolitionist, Pugilist, Strategist. In Edge of Fate, you could potentially see like a Bray Legacy-esque perk where you are damaging a target, and as you damage the target, you get some tick gains of a certain ability, right? Or super on hit, right? We have super on damage on kill, obviously, like with Thresh, but super on hit could potentially be interesting. I mean, you already do that with your weapons, but maybe it increases the rate at which you get super on hit. And then finally, we have utility, right? So utility is the broadest category in perks, you know, by far. You have from Eager Edge to One-Two Punch to Heal Clip, completely different perks, right? So in the utility section, I put stuff that is completely novel and we have not had in the game yet. So like I mentioned earlier, Woven Mail on a weapon perk could potentially be interesting, although it might power creep Navigator a bit. Invisibility on a weapon perk could be potentially interesting. Like imagine, you know, when you crit kill a target and then you reload, you get free invisibility, right? So it's kind of like old stylish, I guess. And then on hit restoration could be potentially interesting. So imagine like a solar machine gun where if you have like a frenzy effect, or like if you've gotten a certain amount of hits in like the past, you know, X amount of seconds, or you hit a certain amount of your mag, you get restoration for 5 or 6 seconds. That could be a perk that exists. And then maybe perks that generate ionic traces, because those don't exist either. Okay. So some interesting stuff potentially that Bungie could look into when it comes to power creep. But let's move on. Okay, next up we have origin traits. Origin traits have recently become a lot stronger, and Bungie has shown that they are very, very willing to make origin traits straight up stronger than perks, like Time Loss Magazine and Subjugation, I would argue, are stronger than 99% of the perks in this game. So potentially interesting stuff here to talk about. So there's 3 ways that Bungie tends to buff origin traits or introduce origin traits, right? Or just make them better in general. The first one is a direct buff. Bungie doesn't tend to adjust origin traits after they've been out. Some people are theorizing that Bungie might nerf Time Loss Magazine or nerf Subjugation in the future. I don't think that's necessarily like really important for them to do. I would rather them spend their time buffing existing origin traits that are not very good. But that aside, an example would be buffing Skulking Wolf, right? So Skulking Wolf used to be basically a PvP only origin trait. And now if you get a kill while you're below 90 HP, I believe, it makes you like de-aggro ads, right? So that's potentially interesting, right? The second way Bungie, I guess, makes origin traits that are power creeped or better is just making them have an entirely new effect that's never really been seen in the sandbox. So Subjugation and Time Loss Magazine, the examples I just mentioned, are extremely strong. And so those are, you know, good candidates for what I'm talking about. And then finally, one thing that people don't really talk about as much, I suppose, is sometimes an origin trait will come out with weapons that are not very good, right? And then, you know, a season later or a year later, usually not a season later, I should say like a year later, Bungie will reintroduce the origin trait on a new set of weapons. And instead, this time around, these weapons make much better use of this origin trait. So an example I can give you that doesn't actually exist, but an example that could exist is Soul Drinker, right? Soul Drinker is an origin trait that works based on the percentage of your mag that you hit before you reload. Now, there are some weapons where it's very easy to hit a very high percentage of your mag because the mag size is 1. So imagine if Soul Drinker came out and Forbearance didn't exist in VOW, right? So you'd be stuck with Submission, you'd be stuck with Cataclysmic, and you'd be stuck with Deliverance, you know, stuff like that, right? And so Soul Drinker would not be nearly as strong of a perk, or it wouldn't be perceived as strong of an origin trait if it had never come out with Forbearance. And then let's say later on, Bungie introduces an Area Denial or a Wave Frame or a Rocket with Soul Drinker, then people would probably think it's a lot stronger, right? So that's what I mean by that. Okay, so origin traits, we're just gonna keep everything on the screen here, pretty straightforward. There are 6 categories of origin trait: ability, damage, refill, splash, stats, and survivability. I think those pretty much self-explanatory, right? So here's what I think Bungie could do to potentially increase the power of origin traits when they make new ones compared to the current candidates that we have in these categories. So for the ability category, pretty tough because Dealer's Choice and Time Loss Magazine are excellent origin traits. Bungie could make an origin trait that is explicitly designed around a single ability. So for example, maybe a Grenadier origin trait, or like a, I don't know, like a some sort of explosive sounding origin trait, and it's just focused on getting your grenade back, right? So maybe you do damage to a target, and on hit, you get grenade energy back or something like that. And then when you throw your grenade, it increases the damage of this weapon that has that origin trait. Just an idea, right? Damage, something interesting that Bungie could do. I mean, nanotech, tracer rocket, subjugation, those are already pretty good. But damage, I would say adaptive damage could potentially be interesting. So the weapon does an adaptive amount of damage increase based on some sort of environmental circumstance, and then roaming based damage, right? So an origin trait that increases the damage of the weapon in roaming scenarios, so in ad clear scenarios. I think I had more specific ideas when I wrote these down, but I think you guys get the gist of what I'm saying. Okay, refill origin traits. I have no clue how Bungie is going to power creep Time Lost Magazine, Nano Munitions, and Cast No Shadows. That is a crazy trio right there, and I genuinely have no idea how Bungie is going to power creep any of these because those are just insane. I don't know. I really have no idea how Bungie is gonna buff I don't know, give better refill origin traits. Those are pretty crazy. Okay, splash origin traits. These are like your Cursed Thrall, Radiolary Transposer, Dark Ether Reaper. These are good for ad clear. I think like a grenade kill trigger could be potentially interesting, right? Where like instead of being a melee kill like Cursed Thrall is right now, when you get a grenade kill, your weapon suddenly gains, I don't know, like a dragonfly-like effect or something like that, right? Stats wise, I think Bungie is going to experiment a lot more with origin traits that increase Armor 3.0 stats, right? So we already have some origin traits that boost Armor 3.0 stats, and we've literally been shown origin traits in the trailer, not trailer footage, but like the creator footage that these origin traits do increase Armor 3.0 stats. So I could definitely see it being interesting. You know, stuff like 2 Excess increases your stats by like a pretty small amount, but I could see Bungie definitely either rebuffing 2 Excess or re-adding Armor 3.0 stat boosts to some other origin traits, or making new ones that really, really strongly take advantage of the Armor 3.0 changes. Okay, and then finally, survivability wise, the only 2 ideas I have really are DR on hit and healing on hit. So damage reduction on hit, land tank is damage reduction on kill. Damage reduction on hit could potentially be interesting. So maybe like imagine a rocket where like the more you spend time doing damage to a boss, the more damage resistance you gain. And then healing on hit could potentially be interesting as well. So like a weapon where like when you hit a certain portion of the mag, each additional hit like heals you for like 5 HP or something. You know, that could be potentially interesting. Okay, my voice is getting very hoarse, but we're gonna try and power through the rest of this. I believe we only have 2 sections left, but exotics are kind of split into weapons and armor, so I guess 3. Okay, exotic weapons. How does Bungie buff exotic weapons or power creep previous exotic weapons? How does these work? Okay, so the first way Bungie does this is raw quantity. Okay, so for example, Parasite power crept every burst damage option that came before it, right? So imagine if you had Parasite on day 1 Atrax, right? Parasite, power creep, burst damage. Choir of One power crept basically every exotic primary to some degree, and exotic specials like exotic special traces that are used for ad clear, because Choir is like a multi-tool. It has like built-in 3-shot Radiolary Transposer, has like a Dragonfly-esque effect, it has destabilizing rounds. It's just like a multi-tool which has like insane minor total damage. And so Choir of One is an example of a raw quantity buff. It's just the raw quantity of its versatility is just unmatched, right? So it's power crept stuff that came before it. The other way that Bungie has been recently kind of introducing a way of power creeping exotics or buffing them is by making an exotic that buffs legendaries. Okay, now technically buffing legendaries would fit into the 3rd bullet, but I wanted to have like a separate thing here because they've been doing this recently with Darcy buffing snipers and Ergo buffing swords, right? So you could in theory maybe have like an exotic that buffs linears, or an exotic that buffs fusion rifles or special GLs or any sort of thing like that, right? And then finally, the 3rd way that Bungie makes exotics that are entirely, power creep winning whatever currently exists is like an entirely novel effect, right? So a Lethanim, completely new effect. We've never had a weapon in Destiny that literally makes ammo, right? The Navigator, it allows you to, the Woven Mail and the healing is nice and whatever, but it basically enabled classes that do not have the ability to create grapple points to enable grapple melee strategies on like Titan and stuff like that. So that is an entirely novel effect. Okay, so let's talk about exotic weapons. Now, I didn't make a table here. Instead, I just screenshotted the tier list of exotic weapons that we have right now. This is the entirety of the S, A, and B tier. Now, exotic weapons, kind of interesting, I suppose. So the first thing that I think could potentially power creep what we currently have is higher or more sustainable or different slot burst than Parasite. So imagine Parasite, except you get that level of burst damage from like a special weapon instead. Or imagine Parasite, except for you wouldn't have only one shot that has like a ton of damage. You would have multiple shots that have like a ton of damage. Or maybe you have like a parasite that doesn't require as many kills, right? So that is one way they could power creep burst damage. A more versatile add clear weapon than Choir of One. That's pretty hard, I would say. I don't think that's going to happen. But if Bungie were to make an add clear exotic, whether special or primary, that is more versatile than Choir of One, that would in fact power creep Choir of One. Higher total damage or DPS than New Land Beyond or Lord of Wolves. So New Land Beyond has very, very high total damage, and it's also like a ranged weapon. And Lord of Wolves is kind of like the equivalent. It has very, very high total damage for a special, but it's more of a melee range equivalent, right? So higher total damage on either of these weapon types with similar ease of use, or higher DPS than either of these weapons with similar ease of use, would result in them being power crept. And then finally, the fourth thing for raw quantity buffs are even more potent add clear than Trinity, Sunshot, or Graviton in primary form. So Bungie hasn't really made like an exotic primary that's at the level of a Trinity, Sunshot, or Graviton in quite a while. And those exotics are, they're pretty old, right? So I don't know, in theory, Bungie could make like a new exotic primary that, power creeps them, especially maybe something in the kinetic slot. That would be nice, right? Because Kvastov it's good, but it's not quite at that level. I mean, I did put it in the B tier as well, but we could potentially see something that's even stronger that's based on, stasis or strand. Okay. The second method of buffing legendaries, I think of all the weapon types that could potentially be recipients of an exotic that buffs them, I would say LMGs, right? Imagine an exotic LMG that's like a galley LMG that makes your other LMGs like have faster fire rate or something. I don't know. Could be something like that. An exotic glaive that buffs glaive melee damage could be potentially interesting, or makes your glaive melee spawn wolf packs or something. Or fusions and LFRs, right? I can see fusion and LFR family being buffed by an exotic option, right? I don't know what that would do to the sandbox, because like linears and fusions are generally kind of okay, but I think buffing legendary linears is not necessarily the end of the world. Okay. And then finally, a novel effect, right? So this is just completely throwing stuff at the wall, really. An exotic with better survivability than Buried Bloodline, right? So maybe an exotic that, I don't know, makes you invisible, but like isn't Heart Shadow, like an exotic primary that makes you invisible, or like an exotic special that makes you invisible or gives you Woven Mail or something like that. We could use another debuffing exotic, right? Because we have Div and we have Tractor, and the other debuffing exotics that exist in this game, like Heart Shadow, they're not that good, right? So we could potentially see maybe another 30% debuff option, right? That could power creep what we have right now. And then finally, an exotic that gives some sort of team-wide buff, right? This is very vague, but I don't know, some sort of team-wide buff, whether it's a damage buff, whether it's surges, whether it's a damage modifier, like how Mask of Bacchus is being changed. An exotic weapon that gives your entire team a special type of new buff, right? That could be an option. Okay, finally, we're down to our last two sections here. Let's go ahead and look at exotic armor next. So exotic armor, the four ways that Bungie buff/power creeps exotic armor are raw quantity. So Syntheseps, Starter Scales, Sanguine Alchemy, that's a category of exotic, right? It just boosts melee damage, boosts super damage, boosts weapon damage, right? Ability regen, Heart of Endless Light, Starfire Protocol, anything that enables the spam of abilities is something, it's like a lever that Bungie can adjust, right? It's a category of exotic. Ammo generation. Now, this one's not that big, right? You have Aeons and you have Cenotaph. That's pretty much it. Bungie could make another exotic that plays with the ammo generation stat. For example, Actium Warrig, for those of you that don't know, is being changed to affect the ammo generation stat, I believe, when you have more stacks. So could be potentially interesting as well. And then finally, survivability. So Gifted Conviction, Speaker Sight, Omnioculus, stuff like this. Okay. So next slide. 4 categories: damage, ability, ammo, survivability. And these are like the kind of top ranking candidates of, or maybe like the best examples of all these candidates from the final shape. So here are my ideas for what Bungie could do potentially to power creep our current existing armor exotics, or make, I don't know, more appealing exotics, I suppose. In the Edge of Fate, Bungie could make some sort of exotic that converts roaming supers better, right? So like a different type of exotic. For example, Pyrogale Gauntlets converts Hammer of Soul, or sorry, not Hammer of Soul, Burning Maul, which is a roaming super, into a burst damage super. Bungie could easily do this with something like, Storm's Edge. Storm's Edge, instead of, doing 3 knife twirls, you could do 1 triple barrage of knives that does like extra damage, right? So Bungie's made exotics like this in the past, but there are plenty of roaming supers that are still kind of, freeload to just convert as well. More weapon boost exotics, right? So we have Lucky Pants. I believe Actium Warrig is going to do something like this in the future. Peacekeepers. So there are plenty of other exotic weapons. There are plenty of other legendary weapon families out there that Bungie could boost with specifically an exotic armor piece. So that's still on the table. And then I do think we could use another grenade damage exotic. We have 99 million melee exotics, right? There's Synthos, Winter's Guiles, Worm Gods, Triton Vice, blah, blah, blah. We only have Verities for grenade damage, right? So make another grenade damage exotic, you know, maybe even if it's like only for like a specific grenade, like I don't really care. You know, make another grenade damage exotic, that'd be cool. Okay, ability stuff. Like I mentioned, like it could be just for like a specific ability. There are plenty of exotics out there, there's plenty of abilities out there, I should say, that don't have a specific exotic tied to them, right? So Controverse Hold, you have Charge Void Grenades, Starfire Protocol, you have Fusion Grenades, Sunbracers, you have Solar Grenades. So, you know, they're Nothing Manacles, you have Scatter Grenades, right? So we can make more exotic armor pieces that are tied to specific abilities, that could be making those abilities like a lot stronger, right? Imagine like a, I don't know, like a Hunter Arc Flux Grenade exotic that makes Flux Grenades do like way more damage or turns them into like throwable nukes or something, you know? So besides ability specific stuff, another way that Bungie could potentially, you know, power creep our current ability exotics is using ability conversion, right? So we have like Mothkeeper's Wraps, for example, which converts your grenade into like 2 Arc Moths. I could see Bungie being like creative and completely unique and converting another specific ability into another, you know, unique entity, right? So that could be potentially interesting. Different triggers just means like, you know, there's surrounded, there's like melee kills, grenade kills, there's like weapon kills. I'm just experimenting with different triggers for activating ability regen buffs instead of just like your average like Hoyle activation trigger. Ammo stuff, it's just the ammo generation stat. I mean, we talked about Actium Warrig being reworked, so you know, there's probably going to be other armor exotics that Bungie might, you know, implement that will affect the ammo generation stat of maybe like specific weapon types. Who knows, maybe they make like Lucky Pants increase your ammo generation when you get, you know, 10 cannon kills. I can see that happening. And then finally, survivability. We don't really have an armor exotic right now that really like generates Void Overshield really well. I mean, there are armor exotics that use Void Overshield, like no backup plans, but there aren't really any exotics that give Void Overshield or like generate it at a very high rate or something like that. I think exotics that make physical structures or like physical entities, you know, those are always kind of a miscellaneous option on the table. De-aggro exotics are pretty interesting. You know, we have some like, you know, like Threaded Spectre, for example, that's not really like an exotic, but that's kind of like what I'm looking into, like de-aggro stuff. Maybe like you throw a grenade or like you lightning surge and it just auto blinds everything near you, right? That could be like a lightning surge exotic. And then finally, DR sources, right? Gifted Conviction is a DR source, Stronghold is a DR source, but we can always have like other DR sources that are, you know, triggered by different effects and not necessarily like casting Ascension or jolting stuff or whatever. Okay, so that is pretty much it for exotic armor. Finally, we're going to talk about subclasses, and then I'm going to go turn on my AC because I am dying. Okay, so the two methods that Bungie tends to use to buff subclasses, which, you know, subclasses are fairly straightforward, so there's really only 2 ways you can. The first thing is raw quantity, right? So it's just a numbers game, right? So they're buffing suspend duration. You know, they buffed Thundercrash damage recently. Those are numbers, right? And then the second option is quality of life. So fragment slot increases, trigger lenience, so making certain effects easier to activate. For example, Gunpowder Gamble is being changed so that any kill will trigger it instead of specifically solar kills. So, you know, affecting how easy it is to activate an effect is a quality of life buff. Okay, so next up we have a tiny table, right? Our final slide here. Quantity, I think Ward of Dawn and Sentinel Shield, I didn't capitalize shield, ignore that. The buff values could be changed, right? So Ward of Dawn bubble could be changed back up to 35%. I think that would, you know, make people use it more. And then Sentinel Shield, I mean, it's already 40%. I don't know, maybe buff it to 45 or 50 or something. We'll see. I think more 30% debuff sources may be coming from different exotics or, you know, different subclass options. Although, I don't know, that would probably maybe eat into tether viability, but I mean, tether viability is already not that high, I suppose. So yeah, I don't know. 30% debuff sources could be potentially interesting. And then super damage rebalancing. So what I mean by this is, I think Cuira's Thundercrash is like a little too strong. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need a nerf. I mean, you could nerf it if you wanted to. I don't think that would be horrible for the game, but it's a little strong. And there are other, like, you know, supers like Nighthawk, which require you to be Radiant, or Nova Bomb, which requires you to pick up 6 orbs for Feast of Light, which literally do less damage. Now, you could argue T-Crash can't be used on all bosses, and T-Crash is like a melee range, you know, super, so it's more like risky or whatever. But, you know, Nova Bomb comes with its own trade-offs too, right? Like Cataclysm Nova, block shots. Celestial Nighthawk, you need to hit a crit on a boss, like if it's a boss that doesn't have a crit, or you miss or whatever, you know, it's like a big deal, whereas T-Crash is pretty easy to hit. So yeah, I do think super damage could use a little bit of rebalancing, either like buff Nova and Goldie like a little bit, or, you know, there's plenty of other supers like Needlestorm that could use a buff too. So Bungie might buff Needlestorm like a crazy amount in Edge of Fate, who knows, right? And then finally, quality of life. I think Frost Armor could have better access and sustain. When I say sustain, I think it's a little bit too easy to like lose all of your stacks and like lose all of your hard work for your DR, whereas Woven Mail is kind of just like a one stack, kind of one stop shop kind of thing. So I could see Bungie buffing Frost Armor like duration, or making it so that the stacks wear off one by one or something in some sort of like meter, or like, I don't know, like the stacks don't just like disappear like when your timer runs out. And then weaker fragment buffs. There's a ton of fragments in this game, like we've talked about in the past for my fragment tier list, that are terrible, either because they're strictly for PvP or because they just suck. So, you know, I would like to see maybe Bungie buff some fragments and create some real contention in terms of what people use, because generally speaking, the way people approach like fragments and builds in Destiny is it's pretty solved, right? Like there are good fragments and people just don't touch the bad fragments. And outside of a handful of situations where you want like a really specific fragment for a specific reason, you're going to be using the same fragments on the subclasses for the most part all the time, right? And then finally, Arc could probably use some general sustain, especially Warlock, right? Because on Hunter you have Combination Blow, on Titan you have Knockout. Arc Warlock doesn't really have any like sustain, you know, Strand Warlock as well, you know, I guess Strand Warlock, no, not really. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of subclasses that could use some like rounding out, I suppose, right? There are some subclasses that have access to DR sources. They have access to refreshable splash damage in terms of either grenade damage or melee damage. They have strong supers. They have self-buffing. They have regeneration. So there are some subclasses that are like super overloaded and have like all this stuff. And then there's some subclasses that have just like one of those things, right? So I could see Bungie maybe potentially rounding out Sandbox a bit more by adding sustain to some subclasses that don't have sustain, or buffing the damage supers of some subclasses that have really bad damage supers. Like, I don't know, giving Stasis Warlock a Stasis super that's like a massive hail barrage or something, you know? I can see that happening. And that might make people want to play Stasis more. That is pretty much it. That is all I have to say for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's a kind of an interesting discussion. I've never seen a D2 content creator kind of like discuss the theory of power creeping and how Bungie might buff things based on their patterns of past behavior. So I hope you guys found this interesting, even though it is probably going to be like an hour and a half long video. I have no idea how long I've been talking for. But yeah, soon we will be doing damage testing for day one stuff. I'm going to be testing realistic scenarios for every single potentially relevant damage option on day one. I'm going to be graphing it all out, and it's going to be there for you guys to look at until day one, or I guess until the Edge of Fate, where I'll be retesting all of those things under different circumstances and reporting on how that goes as well. Okay, that's pretty much it. I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.